Well, folks, we have a whole lot of people. It looks like Gail is just joining us. We're very, very excited. We're stoked that everyone can make it here. Let's commence, everyone. First and foremost, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Tom Wojak. I am a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. I am the co-chair of the America Subcommittee within the DSA International Committee. DSA International Committee, for those who are not aware, is a national appendage of the DSA dedicated to advancing the project of socialist internationalism and solidarity. We are also, DSA, a proud member of the National Network on Cuba, a US-based coalition working to end the US embargo of Cuba and to advance peaceful US-Cuban relations. We are over the moon to have the panelists that we do, the caliber of experts and organizers and journalists that we have assembled here tonight in the advancement of solidarity with Cuba. It is a great honor to introduce each and every one of them. First off, we have Gail Walker. Gail Walker is the executive director of IFCO, Pastors for Peace, and the co-chair of the National Network on Cuba, the NNOC, of which DSA is a member. She's a veteran organizer and advocate of normalization with Cuba, and has just recently returned from Cuba to meet with President Miguel Diaz-Canel. We also have Manolo de los Santos. Manolo de los Santos is the founder and co-executive director of the People's Forum in New York City. He is also a member of the Tricontinental. Manolo, you are one of the lead researchers, I believe, for Tricontinental. In addition to this, his new book, Comrade of the Revolution, Selected Speeches of Fidel Castro, is available now and can be pre-ordered. We also have streaming in live from Havana, Daniel Montero. Daniel Montero is an independent Cuban journalist and producer of Belly of the Beast. Belly of the Beast offers a perspective of Cuban politics, history, and life under US embargo. I highly recommend checking out some of their content. It really is quite special and offers a wonderful narrative of Cuban life that is very rare to encounter in the United States. Without further ado, I would also like to, I'm very, very grateful to introduce our moderator for this evening, Brendan James. Brendan James is the co-host alongside Noah Colwin of the hit podcast Blowback, which most recently chronicled the Cuban Revolution and the conditions surrounding the Cuban Missile Crisis. Blowback is currently available to stream on Stitcher Premium and Spotify. Brendan is a writer, musician, and also a former producer of the popular podcast Chapo Trap House. We're so very, very excited to have everyone. Thank you all so very much. I will be dropping some links throughout the webinar, but without further ado, I would like to hand it off to Brendan James. Ladies and gentlemen, Brendan James.
Thanks, Tom. Everyone can hear me, I presume. Thank you to Tom there, and thank everyone for tuning in. My name is Brendan James. I'm going to be moderating. I'm going to say a little bit to kick us off here, give some context about this conversation, and then we'll go into the questions. The first few will be directed at individual panelists, and then we'll open it up, and I have a bunch that anybody can jump into on the panel. Maybe if you want to raise your hand, or I'll do my best to spot who gets what first. My only shred of credentials on this subject is that I co-host and produce a history program, as Tom mentioned, called Blowback, which just finished its latest season on the long history of the US war on Cuba. And I'm sure some of that history is known to many people watching. It's a very compelling story, one that goes back to the earliest days of US empire, of America being in the empire business. And you get to the Revolution of '59, when Cuba takes back its country essentially from a lot of crooks and gangsters. This was immediately met with a never-ending offensive to reverse that. We have the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, and possibly the most apocalyptic moment was the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis of the next year, but things in the ensuing decades really didn't get much better. It's a story that went on for a long time. And to our point today, it's a story that's actually not over. Cuba is now facing the harshest sanctions that the United States has ever imposed. Not only that, but as we all know, of course, after the COVID-19 pandemic swept the earth, Cuba has also, sort of as a part of that embargo, been forced to develop its own vaccines and protect its population from the virus with a shortage of key medical gear and the potential that it doesn't have due to the embargo. So all of this, of course, happens still as the country lives under the long-standing U.S. embargo, or as many call it, the blockade. The blockade, as a brief background, was imposed in 1960 as punishment for the revolution, which cut Cuba off not only from trade with the United States, but many other nations as well. It blocks Cuba to this day from desperately needed commerce and income. It blocks Cuba from putting its own money in banks that it wants to. It blocks Cubans from accessing swaths of the internet, and it blocks the Cuban people from getting essential things they need, be it food or, as we've learned painfully from the COVID pandemic, medical equipment and supplies. The blockade has recently been estimated to have denied Cuba as much as 130 billion over the years. And that may be easy for the United States to go without, but for a country like Cuba, it is quite a staggering loss of potential and opportunity. So this dual pressure from both the United States and the pandemic, as I'm sure many people noticed, led to a brief outbreak of protests this summer in Cuba, which we'll discuss more. Mainstream coverage of the protests struck the same note as the President of the United States, Joe Biden, that essentially the message was Cuba is a failed state, period, end of sentence. Yet, as the coverage and commentary escalated, especially here in America, the actual scene in Cuba has cooled off a bit. Cuba is still hurting, but the reality of a toppling of the government apparently did not live up to the media's desires. One last thing to mention that happened in Cuba this year. The Communist Party held its 8th Party Congress in the spring. And with that came a pretty historic political change on the island, which was practically ignored in the US. Cuba's presidency transferred from Raul Castro to the current president, Miguel Diaz-Canel. Cuba's leaders, in other words, are now at the highest levels of the government of a younger generation, and one that did not take part in the old days of the so-called Cold War period. Despite that, we see no current change, no thaw, no mercy from the United States. So all of that leaves us with a lot to talk about today, about the reality in Cuba on the ground, as they say, about the devastation that this US policy has created, but also about the remarkable things that Cuba has achieved in spite of that, not just in the history that I mentioned at the top, but in the here and now, at this very moment. And so we're lucky to have a panel here that can give us a better insight into all of these things. And so without further ado, let's get the discussion started. Like I said, I'm going to pose the first few questions to the panelists on an individual level. I'd like to start with Gail. Do we have Gail still? If we don't, I'm not seeing it. Maybe I'll start with Manolo, actually. Manolo, in your work with the People's Forum, there's a lot of emphasis on the importance of establishing connections person to person with people who live in countries or nations that are sanctioned by the United States, punished by the United States. Cuba would be a prime example of this. How does the United States, its government, its media, its culture, how does it attempt to block that potential? How can people in the US and elsewhere overcome those methods to make these connections with the real people in these countries that's so important to happen.
Well, thank you, Brendan, for I think the really good historical and very contextual introduction to our conversation tonight. I think that in our opinion, one of the sort of the biggest collateral damage of the blockade that affects the Cuban people gravely, but also affects the people of this country, is actually being blocked from the experiences, the opportunities to actually relate directly with the people of Cuba and learn and exchange with them in all spheres of life. From the fact that Cuba has been able to transform and sort of begin building a new type of society with many contradictions and many challenges, but definitely something new and different from what we are accustomed to seeing here. But learning from Cuba in the areas of culture and music and science and so many others. So our push is, we would want to be in a moment in history where young people in the United States have no barriers to actually talking to young people in Cuba, to actually have meaningful dialogue and conversations about where does the world go now? I mean, I think there's a deep sense of crisis on the planet that's only been made stronger by the current COVID pandemic that we are still living through. The fact that most young people in the United States see no future for their own lives. I think we can maybe learn something from talking to young people in Cuba, even the young people who might disagree with the Cuban Revolution. But the blockade is right now the biggest impediment to that type of dialogue. And I would emphasize it's a dialogue because it's, for us, not necessarily defending everything that the Cuban government does. It's not about defending everything the Cuban Revolution stands for necessarily, but it is about defending the right of Cuba to have its own social project. It's about defending Cuba's right to its sovereignty, to its independence, and being honest, the right of Cuba to make its own mistakes, the right of Cuba to actually have a process that is not pure or clean or free of contradictions. I want to live in a world where Cuba is, in a sense, freed from the heavy weight that the blockade and US aggression imposes on it. I mean, I think I'm so happy and honored to be here with Daniel because it was, I think, the important work of Bailey of the Beast that put back into our debates, into our discussions, that there has been a 6-decade-old war on the Cuban people that prevents any meaningful conversation, any meaningful dialogue with them. Till we change that element, I don't want to hear any of I refuse to listen to other debates around Cuba.
Well said. Thank you, Manolo. Gail, if I can direct the next question to you, is your connection working?
Yeah, I've really been struggling. I don't know what's going on, but can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine. I'm going to shoot the question to you.
Sure.
So as I mentioned a moment ago, Gail, a significant political change occurred in Cuba this year in the passage of the presidency from Raul Castro to President Miguel Diaz-Canel. And you have just returned not so long ago from Cuba, and you personally met with President Diaz-Canel. Normally, when a country gets a new leader, it's a big moment of reflection and questions. That didn't really happen in the United States, it appears. But you got to be there and you got to meet him. What did you discuss with the president, and what conclusions did you draw about his agenda and the new administration's goals and choices coming up?
Okay, well, again, I apologize for the connection problems, but thank you, Brendan, and thank you, DSA International Committee. It's an honor to be here with my brothers Manolo and Daniel. Yeah, I've really been fortunate. I've had the opportunity to visit Cuba twice in the last 6 months and to witness firsthand many of the challenges that you're referring to, that the island nation is currently facing, as much as one can in the short visits that I've had. Unlike Daniel, who's there and based and can speak, I think in many ways much more authoritatively, you could still witness the combination of the effects of the pandemic and the increasing challenges that the longstanding blockade is presenting for Cuba and its people. That was all on on full display. The long lines, the shortage of medicines, just to name two things. But I did have the opportunity to with President Diaz-Canel, and we discussed a number of different things. He shared that Cuba has started to make protocols not just to focus on prevention, but to prevention of COVID, but to guarantee the quality of life for those who have suffered the long-term effects from COVID. So we spoke a little bit about that. He discussed the oxygen production crises, including the failure of a plant to really due to the inability to acquire spare parts, a direct connection to the blockade. He said that they had to airlift in military troops there in order to fix the plant and to produce oxygen again. And I think it's important to note here how Cuba has used its military to resolve a health crisis, a health-related emergency. At the time of the visit, there were, I believe, 60% of the Cuban population had been vaccinated and administered at least one dose of the vaccine, and 39% or so had all three doses of the vaccine. That number is now increased to nearly 82%. So we talked about that. 82% that have gotten at least one dose of the vaccine, and nearly 45% all three doses. He shared plans for September for the vaccination plan to have 5 million people vaccinated at least once by the end of September, and to increase to 50% of the population. So we spent a lot of time talking about just some of the ways that the country is grappling with the pandemic, about the vaccination of children, and that the focus on trying to get children back into school. We also spoke about the market that reopening gradually because several small businesses had suffered, as well as state businesses, and the importance and significance of that, and really talking about the need to learn to live with the pandemic and to work around it. That was a theme that focused on. We spoke about the brutal smear campaign, that the misinformation that Cuba is being subjected to, and the importance of visiting and seeing the reality for ourselves. He specifically said, siguen viviendo y construyendo. People continue to live and to construct. And he reiterated his acceptance of our invitation, an invitation I extended to him to meet with the caravan, the French shipment caravan that will be traveling down in November. And we're thrilled that we'll be able to have a dialogue with him when that caravan arrives. In terms of my thoughts about him and his administration, it's clear that there's a lot on the table. He's got so much to grapple with. But the sense I walked away from him with was that he's committed to continuing to address the social and economic progress of the country despite the changes presented by the longstanding blockade and all of the ramifications that come along with that. So the work continues, and he's to be up for the challenge. That's my take on the conversation we had.
Interesting. Thank you, Gail. I'm sure we'll return to several of the issues that you described speaking with him about in just a little bit. Daniel, on to you. You are a Havana-based journalist. You're there. And one thing you and your colleagues at Belly of the Beast have underlined, I think, in your work, which I should plug now if anyone has not seen them. They're really, really great journalism coming out of Cuba itself, Belly of the Beast. One thing you've emphasized is despite the immense influence of the blockade on the nation of Cuba. The embargo or the blockade, it has been discussed in Cuba for its entirety, the entirety of its existence, 60 years. It's been talked about for decades and decades. You talk about anything for 60 years, people might get tired of hearing about it as the source of so many ills, even if it's got a ring of truth to it. Are people in Cuba simply sick of hearing about the blockade? And does that make it difficult for the Cuban government to be able to explain and organize policy in response to it? Does that, I guess I should ask, how much does that help the U.S. efforts to propagandize against the government and in some cases to covertly, operate against the government? And if so, how can that kind of thing be addressed, do you think?
Brendan, yeah, I think from the first moment we started addressing how to treat the subject on the war in Cuba, we wanted to start with the note that it is something that we in Cuba are at this point mostly tired of hearing about. Because as you said, it's been going on, the conversation's been going on for way too long. And the challenge for us was to find creative, new, appealing ways to do that. Because even though our main audience wasn't the Cuban people, we're working for an American audience, and this is, in most cases, new to them. We wanted to, of course, also please the Cuban audience that we had. So we were very clear that we needed to establish that. And because it is a reality, and I think you must understand that it is used a lot. And I will say, to be fair, that in some cases it is used disproportionately from the part of the Cuban government, and that contributes to the people feeling like, okay, so this is the blockade again, right? But none of this denies the fact that it is very real. And if you ask me, and I'm sure if you ask many of you, it is the main impediment right now, as it has been for a long time, for us to solve the problems we have, at the same time as it is one of the causes, one of the leading causes of all of those issues. I don't think there is one problem in Cuba where you can say, well, the embargo doesn't play a role here. You can discuss the amount to which the embargo adds to that specific issue, but I can assure you that it is there. In terms of propaganda, I think, of course, for the United States government, that is something. Propaganda against the Cuban government is what validates the embargo. They will encourage it and they will justify it with that propaganda. I mean, for most Americans, Cuba is a very unknown subject, right? So whatever little they might have heard about Cuba is more than likely not good, and there's a problem with that, because the more people in America know about Cuba, the more they can comprehend that what's happening is not fair. And I think that takes me back to the last thing you were mentioning. What can we do about it? I think it's all about knowledge, as it is in most cases. Because if the bad things that are happening in Cuba, even lies, take all the spaces, and people don't have the opportunity to see the other side of that coin, then the interpretation they're making of Cuba, if they're making any interpretation, is based on half-truth, which is the same as it is based on lies. Because Cuba, like any other country, is a very complex place. We have specificities, that is true. But the fact that it is a complex country, I think is undeniable. So I think, to end with that, I think propaganda is used to justify this cruel policy, basically the war that they've been waging against Cuba for decades. And the way to fight it is knowledge and conversation in spaces like this, and joining forces, Cuba and the United States and everyone who wants to come along and help out, honestly, to try to get more people on board, just to hear a little bit more. I think that was the best takeaway for us with the war on Cuba, was to have people that didn't know anything, not the ones that we knew that would like it, was to reach people that didn't know about Cuba, and then they say, wait, why is my country doing this? Because people don't know. So, yeah.
Yeah, very much so. Well put. I will now unleash the general questions. So maybe, again, just to save us all some headache, if anyone wants to take one right away, just throw a finger up. we can always do the uncomfortable silence for a second. I excel at those, but I'll try to see who wants to jump in when they'd like to. First off, here, we've discussed the embargo a bit in general, but in fact, the embargo was recently supercharged by the Trump administration. It may seem like a lifetime ago, but it was not really so long. Apart from completely reversing the overture between the United States and Cuba that had begun at the end of President Barack Obama's second term, the Trump administration imposed over 200, I believe it's 243, new sanctions. I'd like to know, and perhaps the audience would like to know, what did the Trump government do to juice what seemed like an already untoppable policy to isolate and punish Cuba? How did they augment the existing embargo, and how has Cuba suffered and coped and managed after the Trump administration's moves there? Anyone? Daniel?
I'm gonna make it short, so I'm sure Manolo and Gail wanna jump in as well.
Sure.
First of all, I think overall there's no way to separate the country's economy and the government's economy, and that is the main one of the main myths that are discussed when the United States government talks about the embargo, right? They say, like, well, we're applying this on the Cuban government, right? But governments provide services. And in the case of Cuba, those services are large. So if you are hindering that government's capability of trading, of making money, you are directly hindering the people. But just leaving that aside for a moment, there were plenty of sanctions that affected the people directly. You can start off by talking about remittances, for instance. To close down on the ways of sending remittances to Cuba affects the people because a large amount of the Cuban population has family abroad, especially in the United States. You can talk about the closing of the embassy. I know people who have been waiting for a visa, a family reunification visa for the United States for years, because they have no embassy to go to. They have to travel to a third country to do that process, and they're still waiting. And you must consider there's no guarantee that once you spend that money and go to another country, you will get in, right? But look at it from the other side, like tourism. Tourism has more and more become one of the main sectors of our economy. And during the Obama change of policy, that tourism actually grew. We were grateful to have American tourists coming here, not just for the money income, also because the political change that could come from that. And cutting on that affected the Cuban people. But think about it the other way. Back in the Obama days, entrepreneurs were talked about a lot, right? The growth of the country's entrepreneurial sector that started in 2011 grew exponentially with Obama, and they were some of the people that were mainly affected by Trump's change of policy, by the sanctions that were applied in that period of time. And of course, that has received very little coverage. When back then it was everything you saw everywhere in the United States. When you heard about Cuba, you say, oh, look, this business is thriving. But no one talks about the businesses that closed because of Trump's change of policies. So, I mean, back in 2019, the country basically stopped. No buses, no cars. We had to walk a lot of places, basically because they wouldn't let oil coming into Cuba, you know, so from Venezuela, which is our main provider. So these are things that, for us, are very clear and direct for the Cuban people, not for the Cuban government, for us here.
Sure, Manolo.
No, Daniel was spot on. I mean, I would only emphasize that I think what was key about the Trump administration, and I would say the Biden administration seems to want to continue in that same aggressive spirit, is basically very surgical operations against Cuba. I mean, I strongly believe, this is my strong belief, that there were several offices in the United States government, not just in the State Department, but also in Treasury, in OFAC, in the National Security Council, that very carefully thought out what are the things that could most affect a great majority of Cuban people in their daily livelihood. And they did that with the cutting of remittances. They did that with the cutting of flights, of commercial flights to most of the island. They did it with what, Daniel was mentioning, which I would like to mention is just modern day piracy. The fact that the US was actually hijacking oil tankers in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, coming from not just Venezuela, but oil tankers coming from Algeria and other countries in the world, and literally hijacking them and selling off the proceeds for their own Cuba programs. They literally did everything within their possible might. The actual targeting of all Cuban financial transactions, the creation of a major propaganda campaign that we saw in the last few years, labeling Cuban doctors abroad as slaves of the Cuban dictatorship, which was geared towards not just, attacking the medical programs themselves and the services they were providing, but attacking the fact that this is actually one of Cuba's greatest sources of revenue after tourism. They were doing everything within their might, and they are still doing it, to cut Cuba's livelihood. That's why I think, contextualizing this as a war, and the fact that this war has only become more sophisticated, that it's become essentially the greatest example of what a hybrid war looks like, because the US is attacking on all possible fronts with every tool in its arsenal. To think that there are people in the US government who wake up every day thinking about how to basically be more aggressive towards Cuba is worrisome, because it's ultimately based on a very incorrect premise that if you just tighten enough, if you push the Cubans just a little bit harder, the Cuban government is going to fall tomorrow. And it's like the lesson that they haven't figured out in 60 years, that no matter how much you push the Cubans, how aggressive you are, things might get harder, people will complain, there will be less buses in Havana, there'll be less food and longer lines, yet Cubans continue to build their country. Even when many have to leave, but those migrants still are in one way or another building their country. The US government hasn't figured out this element of resistance of the Cuban people.
Yes, I think as far as everything in our arsenal, I just would mention briefly to people who aren't aware, in addition to everything our panelists have talked about, on my little program, we recently did an episode just about the use of rap music, even in Cuba, that there was an infiltration of music festivals, of the hip hop scene in Cuba. Was led by USAID, sort of disguised as the kind of cultural exchange that we previously mentioned is quite desirable. Even those channels are used as an instrument of ultimately toppling the regime, at the very least complicating things. I should make a self-criticism right now. I just realized in the earlier part of my little intro, I said that President Diaz-Canel just became the president. I meant that he became the chairman of the party. That's what happened this year. So don't take anything I say seriously, probably for the rest of this event. But let me just amend that. Next question. As we mentioned earlier, Cuba has not just faced down the blockade in recent years. The COVID-19 pandemic, as we've already touched on, has been pretty devastating. But it sort of became like a sort of mutation of the embargo itself, because trying to handle that virus requires your ability to control your own economy, which Cuba does not fully have under the blockade. Where has the island succeeded so far where others have failed despite that? And on the flip side, what shortcomings can we identify, and how might those be dealt with even with the blockade in place?
I'll jump in, Brendan.
Sure.
I think that essentially, Cuba's commitment, really, when it comes to preventative care, both in the rural and urban areas, and its ability to really reorganize the delivery of care, sort of sets it, in many ways, sets it apart. After in 1959, the triumph of the revolution, there were about 3,000 doctors, I guess, that had stayed in the country and didn't immigrate to Florida. And, they were the vanguard, I guess, in terms of really trying to push for expanding medical services. And all of that snowballs into, I think, what has really become a incredible model when it comes to addressing healthcare. There's an excellent book that was recently put out entitled "The Cuban Healthcare: The Ongoing Revolution" by Don Fitz. And in the foreword of that book, he writes about the overcoming of the former system's racist and classist discrimination required confronting the contradiction that equal health, egalitarian health, healthcare could not be attained within a system that was inherited by capitalism. I mean, he was just making the connection, the distinction between what a socialist country approach to healthcare is, and I think that's for me, that means truly putting people first, people at the center of their healthcare system. They made a genuine commitment to public health. And anybody who's lived, certainly, I'll just talk about in the United States, and has seen countless people use the emergency room as their first tier of, dealing with healthcare. And anybody who's actually visited Cuba and seen that tier system, the family doctors, everybody in the neighborhood, the polyclinics for that next level of care, hospitals, institutes. It's a very well-defined, I think, model that the world would certainly benefit from. And so when we talk about strength, I think that's clearly a place where Cuba has made a mark. I'll just lastly say that if we look at this whole contact tracing, pesquisaje, the ability for these doctors to actually go out into neighborhoods, door to door, knocking on doors to see if people were sick, particularly during the pandemic, is an indication of that kind of a model that we certainly didn't see, in the U.S. I understand there are different countries, different sizes, and all, but the model is when you talk about what has done well and what we could learn from, that's what I would point to.
Sure. Thank you, Gail. I'll bring up just a tad of history here. The longtime scholar of Cuba, Helen Yaffe, recently wrote that since 2019, conditions reminiscent of the special period have been returning to Cuba. This refers to the decade, for anyone listening, of the 1990s, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the so-called Eastern Bloc, and therefore the destruction of Cuba's trading network, its economic and political world that it lived in. And so the economy went into free fall, and the U.S. embargo remained unchanged. Conditions got very bad. Caloric intake plummeted, infrastructure rotted, supplies dwindled over the years, and energy blackouts as well were relentless. They can still happen, but it was round the clock. Now, of course, Cuba and its system made it out of that crisis intact, if embattled. How do we think the current situation from those who are there or who have visited recently or at all, how does the current situation compare to the special period? And is that an important thing to keep in mind, that period these days? Daniel, go ahead.
Well, I didn't live through it, okay? But I think I've lived through the special period through the generation that preceded me. Every Cuban my age has plenty of anecdotes from that time, because it was a very difficult time for the country. As you said, most of our economy was devastated in Cuba. Now, I have actually asked this question to that generation, how does it compare? And even though opinions are a little different, and the majority says the special period was still harder, they do find the points of comparison in terms of scarcities. Now, we are used to scarcities, but this last year and a half has been a new level for Cuba. The reasons, of course, are different. Back then, you had the country's economic system had to be rebuilt. And right now is because between sanctions and COVID, the existing system has suffered, right? I do think that the parallel is that Cuban government, Cuba as a whole, has had to find new ways of circling those scarcities. You said that Cuban revolution has come out of that, even though the situation is real bad. And I think the steps taken back in 2011 of allowing for private businesses and opening up the economy proved right, particularly in this period in which those openings have opened more. We are trusting more in the small businesses to solve the issues. I think it has been a valuable lesson that centralization doesn't work for everything. Okay, that there are things that demand a greater involvement from the people, not just from that ideological standpoint, but from the economic as well. And in the other hand, I would say that this is also a very interesting period in Cuba to see, like through a magnifying glass, the effect of sanctions. Because the fact that we're going through so much, it makes it so much harder to find a solution because of the sanctions that are imposed. Like the options the Cuban government and Cuba as a whole has had to get past the problem we're in right now are fewer and fewer and fewer. And you can see it here all the time.
And I just wanted to add to that, if possible, that I think the challenge, in the special period, Cuba was actually capable, precisely because of how difficult the situation was, to build very creative solutions. Decentralization of many areas of society, decentralizing areas of the economy, generating a huge agroecological movement in the country to sort of provide alternate sources of food, a huge movement to actually become more self-reliant, which is why in the medical fields, which is why Cuba, in a sense, is now a pharmaceutical, power in the world, generating the capacity of the country to respond to multiple crises. But the reality is that the U.S. has found every way possible to tie Cuba's hands behind its back and then yell at it to say, you are incompetent and you don't know how to take care of people. This whole accusation of a failed state comes in part out of the complete tying of Cuba's hands behind its back. And I think we in the US have to constantly bring this up in the debate, bring this up in the discussion, to actually highlight the fact that Cuba could actually be living up to its full potential. Cuba actually has, even with the limitations of the blockade, if only we were to remove the 243 sanctions imposed by the Trump administration and maintained by Biden, if we were to just remove those, Cuba would actually be able to go to a certain level of self-reliance to meet many of its own needs. I mean, Cuba, for one thing, has never been a static society. Anyone who knows Cuba well knows that Cubans are constantly going back and forth, trying to figure out what works for them. And when they were in the last few years trying to figure that out again, it was the US that firmly put its foot on Cuba's neck to prevent any possibility of actually building a more sustainable society for its own people, particularly for its young people. What we're seeing now in terms of outbursts has so much to do with the fact that we are preventing every avenue that Cuba has to defend itself and to build what it wants out of the world. And lastly, I just wanted to add, tying into the previous question that was raised, because I think it's a key element of how we think about Cuba in the world and how we even think about public health care in the world, which is that the success of Cuba's healthcare, precisely because of the lack of so many things, isn't only a question of how many doctors it has or what sort of medical innovations they're able to make. Cuba's amazing response to COVID has so much more to do with the mobilization of its people. The fact that anyone you talk to in Cuba is almost like a doctor. I mean, I bet we can ask Daniel right now, and he probably can tell you more about COVID than most people in the US can tell you. The fact that scientific thinking and rational thinking is a huge part of Cuban culture today is the reason why Cuba can face the pandemic in the way it does. The fact that it can actually count on the large sectors of society to actually not just be disciplined and sort of stay at home when needed to, but actually actively participate in, creating masks, cleaning hospitals, cleaning out clinics, bringing people to the clinics, taking care of the sick. All these things are a huge part of why Cuba was able to respond to the pandemic in ways that no other country has. The fact that at this point, by November, Cuba will have vaccinated over, about 92% of its population, is a huge feat that could only be done if there was mass participation in that project.
Well said.
I want to
Sure,
Can
Gail.
I just say something real super quick? It relates to what Manolo was just speaking on, that, walking down the street, people will call you out about, mask wearing. I mean, there's really this sense of vigilance that I certainly don't, haven't experienced on quite the same level here in my hometown. But the other thing is, I think that the real the point of what Cuba could do if given the freedom to be able to take on the challenges is a really important point. In the midst of the pandemic, in the midst of all these challenges, there were people. There was the brigades of car caravan of folk that were able to go to Matanzas when it was a hot spot to try to address the crisis at its root. That was an organic, homegrown, approach to, I think addressing the problem. I just think that whole issue of what Cuba could do if given the space, and perfect, no one is saying that it's perfect, but there are certain the undeniable truths when you really look at what Cuba's been forced to contend with for all this time.
Right. We've touched on this a bit. I think I'll just make this the question where we can deal with it head on. An obvious question: how does the Biden administration depart from the Trump and Obama administrations in policy? Is there any reason people observing the situation should be optimistic about Biden? Fidel Castro once said he really didn't expect to ever see any progress with a first-term president. Biden also appears rather, at this moment, disinterested or rather uninterested in continuing any of the Obama moves toward normalization. The State Department flacks or Jen Psaki televised questions you see are quite on the record about that. So what can we discern here about the Biden administration's intentions and if there is any potential there?
Well, I think that Biden is like an old shark. He smelled blood in the water on July 11th. And he said, I'm going to go all in and Cuba's going to fall tomorrow. And we're going to, be having parties on the Malecón celebrating Cuban freedom and whatever the hell that means, And it took him a few weeks to actually fully realize that, actually, my plans are actually not going to become true. These sort of subversive plans to overthrow the Cuban Revolution weren't actually becoming realistic. And he had to begin sort of taking a few steps back. The more aggressive talk of, tomorrow, we're going to be celebrating freedom and so on, had to be tempered and had to sort of be pushed back. But in reality, the project of aggression, the very clearly put, the imperialist project, which has been in place from the United States for hundreds of years towards Cuba, has not changed with the Biden administration. And in fact, we're facing a Biden administration that is refusing to even budge on the most humanitarian, most basic things. We published a letter earlier this year called Let Cuba Live, signed by over 400 intellectuals, artists, personalities, celebrities across the United States and in Cuba, simply asking for very humanitarian demands. Number one being, allow remittances to be sent from the United States to Cuba. Allow private US citizens to be able to send money to families and friends on the island, not mediated by the Cuban government. And he refuses to budge on this. That's the first sign that this is a president that, again, does not comprehend or does not actually want to comprehend the gravity of the situation and wants to dig his heels into an anti-Cuba policy. I don't suspect that there'll be major or any meaningful change in the next few months or even in the next couple of years. I think Biden, who actually doesn't owe the Miami Cubans anything, they actually didn't help him win his election. They didn't bring him anything to the table, but he's bending over to them, which is the first sign of weakness. And we're probably going to hear the excuse that we hear so often with these Democratic presidents. Maybe in the second term. I have to be able to get reelected before I can do anything. Well, I don't know if we can allow for our Cuban family, our Cuban friends, we can't allow for Cuban young people to be left with no other option but to wait for a second term. So I think the real pressure, I would say, is not so much on what Biden does or doesn't do right now, but what are we as movement people, as activists, as people who consider themselves friends of Cuba, willing to do to, again, change the understanding or the common sense towards Cuba? How do we rebuild a sense that says Cuba is not our enemy, Cuba is actually our sister, Cuba is actually our friend, we need a different type of policy? When that again becomes the voice of the majority of people in this country, like it did actually not that long ago during the Obama administration, then Biden will be forced, the US government will be forced to have to reevaluate its policy.
I just wanted to.
Gail, go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, I just reiterate. Go ahead, Brent.
Well, I was actually going to pick up on, maybe we're both going the same direction, because I was going to pick up precisely on what Manolo just said at the end there. So it was my last question, really. How can this issue, the issue of Cuba, the struggle of Cuba right now, specifically the end to the blockade, how can it be made tangible, real, and urgent to people outside of Cuba, particularly in the US, the country responsible for the blockade? And, maybe a bit old-fashioned, but specifically, how can one connect the struggle of working people specifically in the US with the struggle of Cuba?
Yeah, so you're right. We're kind of going in a similar direction. I just wanted to say that, what Manolo said about first-term presidents and that maybe in the second term, that's crazy too, because at the second term, then you have the person running for their party for the next go round, and it's just one big circular, mess, and nothing, or things rarely get accomplished. But I think that obviously it's important to do things. I think from the U.S., the very country that's been blockading Cuba, I think that's important work. That's the work that many of us have been doing. Certainly the work IFCO's been doing through its transshipment caravans, and we're planning to go again in November. But I think it's also about continuing to work with our friends within these sort of within the legislative field, whatever progressive legislators are out there, but also reaching out to youth, to artists, to the very, communities that the U.S. is trying to really take advantage of, that the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID are attempting to co-opt. So youth, people of color, LGBT, artists, and we've had tremendous successes in the past, but we've got to make, I think, links between at least the positive things that Cuba has been able to do, whether that be in the area of health or education or housing or sustainable development, and making linkages between those concrete successes and the concerns and the passion of people, in the U.S., and that's the way that if there's going to be any kind of really, I think, clarity of understanding and lifting up of solidarity, that it's got to be in that kind of concrete interconnectedness, and just making sure that people really recognize it, what Cuba has been able to do in terms of befriending the neglected and the disenfranchised and the alienated in this world, and particularly by the U.S. and its associates and of the empire.
Either if Daniel or Manolo, if you want to jump in, yeah, sure, Daniel.
Yeah, you asked how can we link the struggle of the working class in America with the struggle of the Cubans, and I think the basis to answer that question is to understand that we live in a globalized world, and the structural problems that we share as a world, as a global society, affect each country in a pretty similar way. Even though Cuba and the United States have very specific realities, we're both affected by structures that empower the same people, that keep the same people oppressed. Now, in the case of Cuba, you might see in it on an international sphere. You have the most powerful country in the world, with the feet on our necks. But in the case of the working class in America, you have that government too. And you have the companies that actually run the world. And we have them too, because we live in that world. And the other thing I would say, the other way to link it, is that the social struggles are the same. It doesn't matter that Cuba has a different problem, has a different reality than the United States in specific matters. Racism is here too. Machismo is also here. These kind of things are everywhere. And I think that when people think of fighting racism, of fighting machismo, of fighting any problem we have as a society, you cannot focus on your country's reality alone. You have to focus on trying to achieve that change in a global sphere, because it is on a global sphere that you are affected by these issues. So I think that is the way to connect.
I mean, as a communist, I always ask the question, who is our enemy? Know your enemy, and then we know how we align on different things. And our enemy continues to be capitalism. Our enemy continues to be white supremacy. And where we see the heads of white supremacy and capitalism, it's the same voices that attack Cuba ferociously. The same people who continue to deny voting rights to poor and working people in this country, who deny voting rights to Black and brown people in this country, are the same forces that continue to seek aggression towards Cuba. When you see who are the forces in the United States that were okay with leaving 11 million working families in this country without the right to a home, with the risk of eviction, are the same people who wish to steal the homes of Cuban working people in order to create their own capitalist paradise. Our enemies are the same. And therefore, I actually don't see any separation. I never separate between the struggles for justice, the struggles for a new society in the United States, with the struggle of the Cuban people. And again, and I say struggle with the full meaning of a struggle that has contradictions, that has setbacks, that is never clean, that is never pure, that is never linear. Which is why I joined the DSA comrades tonight, because we are in the same struggle together against all the forces that are for death on the planet, against humans and nature. I'm with the project of life that Cuba represents with so many challenges, which is the same project of life that DSA fights for here in the United States.
Very well put. Thank you to all of our panelists. This is sort of the point where I have the wrap up written down. So I will give anyone, who wants to a last sort of closing statement if they'd like. If there was anything I didn't get to or anything you'd like to say. Does anyone have one last bit?
I'll just jump in. I think that the importance of people going and seeing and experiencing Cuba for themselves can't be understated. It's an opportunity for me to once again say that the French Shipment Caravan will be going down in November. John Waller, who's on the call, would be remiss in fussing at me if I didn't mention that again. There's ways to find out about that. I'm sure that's being shared in the chat. But the point is, I think that a big part of why there's been such a focus on, the misinformation campaign at this moment has been because there was so much positive play that Cuba had been receiving in terms of the doctors, in terms of the fight against COVID. It's going back to fight against Ebola. ELAM, the Latin America School of Medicine. Who can not love a scholarship program that allows people from underserved communities to be trained as physicians to go back and serve in underserved communities. All of these, I think, are positive messaging that's been, focused on Cuba. And I think that in many ways, this was an opportunity to try to cut Cuba off at the knees. But the only way that people can really challenge, I think, and appreciate the good, bad, the ugly, is go and see and talk with people and breathe the air and eat the food and drink the mojito and go to Cuba. So that would be my message.
Well put. I will be there hopefully in November as well, Gail. So maybe I'll see you there if you're going to be there. I think this is as good a time as any to thank our panelists. I really appreciated being able to talk with them and for them to tolerate my long-winded questions. So I will hand it back to Tom now. And again, thank you, Tom, for inviting all of us together for this chat. It was really good.
Thank you so much, Brendan. What an embarrassment of riches to be speaking with you all. I truly feel great gratitude from the absolute bottom of my heart that everyone could make it out here tonight. Thank you, by the way, to everyone who made this possible. Thank you to the Democratic Socialists of America, the largest socialist organization in the United States. If you want more information about that, I've included a link to all sorts of resources that you can click on. I highly recommend being a member. I've been a member for about 5 years now. Also included in the DSA Cuba Solidarity resource documents, we have the DSA International Committee, which is, as I said, the sponsor of this event. And also, we are now taking applications for membership. If you are a DSA member and you feel very, very passionately, come on board. Water's fine. Really doing some very, very exciting project. And our subcommittee, the IC Americas subcommittee, which I am co-chair of, just voted to unanimously prioritize Cuba as a priority campaign. So please expect future Cuba Solidarity action in the near future. Further, we have included a form, a DSA Cuba Solidarity form. If you're interested, I am pasting it now. in signing up for this. I highly recommend you do. It is just a little bit of information to keep everyone abreast in the event of future Cuba Solidarity organizing as we develop our network within DSA. You do not need to be a DSA member to sign it. Hey, most exciting of all, tonight we have a Cuba Solidarity organizing call, a very, very brief one, only 30 minutes, which will be held at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This panel represents the launching point for a lot of Cuba Solidarity action. We will get the event link posted in just a second here, but all of this information can be found in the document. Last but not least, tonight, we would really like to encourage people to donate to the Saving Lives campaign. The Saving Lives campaign, run by the Global Health Partners, is dedicated to legally shipping syringes and other medical materials to Cuba to assist their fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. It has been an overwhelming success. I think at this stage, they have already shipped 6 million medical syringes to Cuba, but for all the reasons that we as socialists are aware of, we still need to send them medical materials. So I am posting the link for that right now. Beyond that, folks, thank you all so very much. As we discuss the many challenges that face us as we struggle as hard as we possibly can against the Cuba embargo, I would like to end on a note of hope and a melody even. And so for this reason, I would like to call up Pablo O'Connell. He is a DSA member. He is a member of New York City DSA and Sing in Solidarity Socialist Choir. And he will be singing for us a beautiful revolutionary Cuban song, Paz con Dignidad, composed by the revolutionary Cuban musician, Carlos Puebla. So Pablo, take it away.
Hello, friends, comrades, compañeros y compañeras. My name's Pablo. Thank you so much, Tom, for that introduction and for all of these fantastic panelists. What an inspiring evening. I'm so happy to be playing for you this beautiful song by Carlos Puebla, in which he says, the people want paz con dignidad, peace, but peace with dignity, peace with reason, with full sovereignty, clean and clear as the day, not imposed by a foreign power. So thank you all so much for having me, and please enjoy. Cuba ha dicho su verdad con palabra transparente, la paz que venga sonriente, pero no sin dignidad. Nosotros queremos la paz, pero paz con dignidad. Nosotros queremos la paz, pero paz con dignidad. La paz pero con razón, con cabal soberanía, limpia y clara como el día, esa es nuestra condición. Nosotros queremos la paz, pero paz con dignidad. Nosotros queremos la paz, pero paz con dignidad. Esa paz tiene que ser para todos de provecho, de respeto y de derecho, no de fuerza y de poder. Nosotros queremos la paz, pero paz con dignidad. Nosotros queremos la paz, pero paz con dignidad. Nuestro derecho a la paz lo ganamos con razones, con dignidad, con cañones y con otras cosas más. Sepa el yanqui en su obsesión que para llegar a esto, aquí hay un pueblo dispuesto, con armas y con razón. Nosotros queremos la paz, pero paz con dignidad. Nosotros queremos la paz, pero paz con dignidad. Nosotros queremos la paz, pero paz con dignidad. Nosotros queremos la paz, pero paz con dignidad.
Solidarity, everyone. Now let's go end that blockade. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Everyone have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you again so much to our wonderful panelists. Solidarity forever. Hasta la victoria siempre. We're going to win. All right. See you around, folks.